Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you to the IGC for inviting me to come here. It's a great privilege. I've been in Lahore before. It's 19 years ago now, so it's a while. And my kids have sort of 50% of the great-grandparents of my children are from Lahore, so there's a sort of an intimate connection here that dates some time back. The topic of this paper is something that Farzana and I and Sharon have worked on. We have got 2 papers here. The next one will use some of the same data for a different purpose. And I'm going to sort of jump right in at the policy end. Let me see here if I can get this working. Yeah. So the focus here is really on affirmative action policies, right? And on political reservations for women in India, on quotas and the impacts of quotas on different types of governance outcomes. And we're going to focus on one large public program that most of you will be familiar with, namely the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, programs under the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. So the motivation here for looking at women in the sort of sphere of politics stems partly, I think, from a large literature on women as agents of change and development within the household. This empirical literature has left little doubt about the sort of the benefits and gains from allowing women larger resource access, educating them and so forth, and the spillover effects on children are particularly strong, and that applies to health, to nutrition, and to educational outcomes, and it's not beyond, and it's beyond dispute. What I'm going to do here is to start with a quote from Bina Agarwal and what she describes as the potential of presence. What happens when we introduce quotas that allow women a presence in politics, either in the form of political leadership or through a presence in governing bodies? And there have been sort of policy changes on both fronts in India that we're going to take advantage of. So theoretically, this presence may translate into what you can call diversity dividends. There's a book by E. Scott Page, Princeton University Press, 2007, where the sort of idea here is that people enter groups and common bodies with different types of experiences and different types of knowledge, and that in itself may lead to changes that are beneficial. There's also a large experimental literature which has looked at differences between women and men when it comes to attitudes to corruption, when it comes to commitment to ethical conduct and so forth. That may lead to other governance gains. And then there's a sort of a third way, which is a little more sober, which suggests that nothing may happen or impacts may even be detrimental, and that such detrimental effects might be of a temporary nature. And that is a sort of a point that's made particularly strongly by Pranab Bhajan, Dilip Mukherjee, and others. Okay, so if you look at the existing evidence here, because this is not a new area of research. There's been quite a lot of work done on this because of the policy of the Indian government. But it really goes back to 2 cross-country studies by Dollar et al. And Swamy et al. From 2001, which found that greater female political representation or presence in the bureaucracy might be associated with lower corruption. The problem with both these studies is that they are cross-country, and that this might just be a spurious correlation, in the sense that countries with more women present in politics may also have lower corruption, and there's no sort of causal link between the two at all. It's just a simple correlation. So for this type of question, it's very important to close in, or to try to close in on causal relationships, and to try to understand the underlying mechanism. What is it that is going on here? So, there, okay. So the sort of, we've been talking about randomization and RCTs. The unique thing about political reservations at the GP level, Gram Panchayat level in India, is of course that what you have is sort of a perfect natural policy experiment, in the sense that the GPs that are going to have a female head is determined through a random process. So you have the kind of setting that the people from JPAL would dream about, and that they've been taken due advantage of already. One of the first studies, or the first study, using data from GPs in West Bengal and Rajasthan, this Chattopadhyay and Duflo, found that in Gram Panchayats, which have a female village council head, a reserved female village council head that is, determined in the random manner, public goods investments more strongly reflect the preferences of female voters. A follow-up paper by Duflo and Topolova show more sort of dramatic effects, in that there's both a better availability and a higher quality of public goods in such GPs. This is strong and compelling evidence. Then there's also an important paper which looks at the electoral changes that occur with exposure to female reserved leaders. And what Beeman et al. Find and report in QT 2009, also from West Bengal, is that that people who've had a female leader in the past were less likely to have paid a bribe to receive BPL cards or obtain a voter connection, and also that exposure to female political leaders is associated with electoral gains. Okay, so more women come forward to stand for elections and also have better chances of winning those elections. These are, again, compelling results. However, there's also some critical voices here. So there's another stand, and that other stand is that there are no news, or that the news are not that good. So in 4 southern states, Ban and Rao 2006 report that in Gram Panchayats with female leaders, that they are no better or no worse in the performance than those with male leaders, and there's no sign or trace of women politicians being more female-friendly than others. And then there's Pranab Bardhan and Dilip Mukherjee again, and co-author, which find that there's a significant worsening of targeting of SC and ST households in GPs with a female head. And the interesting thing here is that they pin this finding on women's relative inexperience as political leaders. So that's the sort of the broad overall story so far. So what do we do? What do we do that is new here? Well, we take advantage of the same policy because it gives a huge identification benefit. We focus on corruption and the quality of delivery of NREGA, as I mentioned, in the state of Andhra Pradesh. What we have, which is unique here and which is particularly interesting, is that we have a panel of official audit data report, panel data set of official audit reports, which we have worked hard on to translate, with the help, of course, from original Telugu into English, and then made use of this. And the interesting thing here is that the phasing in of NREGA coincides very perfectly with the timing of elections, so that the GP elections here that we look at and follow took place in 2006, and that coincides perfectly with the arrival of NREGA in the Indian scene. So our study here, what is new here, is that we look at the time dimension of governance. So what happens over time to governance in GPs that have women political leaders? That's the new thing. Okay, so a little bit briefly on the program itself. I'm sure most of you are familiar with it. This is a right-based scheme, and that I'm sure you know. And the sort of the role of the Gram Panchayat in implementation here relates to registration of beneficiaries to the issuing of job cards to beneficiaries, which should be free of cost, to the application of for work under the scheme, and then also to the sort of related records for wages and for work done, and for the disbursement of those wages. There are other things that the GP does as well, but I don't have time to get into that here now. Okay, so our data, we have used the funding from the IGC to generate original primary data. I'm focusing on the third one here, which is the most important, which relates to beneficiary households, where we have 500 households across 300 GPs from 8 districts of Andhra Pradesh. The audit reports, as I said, are also from the same surveyed GPs and cover the period 2006 to 2010 as indicated, and then we also have other secondary data from the census and from the State Election Commission. All right. So one thing one has to do, of course, when one looks at a sort of a randomization exercise and procedure is to see that there's good balancing properties between the Gram Panchayats which have reservations and the Gram Panchayats which don't. And when we compare those, and I'm not showing that here, we don't find any differences between them. And also similarly, when we look at the households across these different types of Gram Panchayats, we don't find any differences there to write home about. An interesting thing, though, which is consistent with what others have said earlier, is that there are differences between these sarpanches in reserved and unreserved GPs. So for instance here, if we look at age and if we look at education, there's a large difference in particular for education. So the women, the female reserved sarpanches, have much less education than sarpanches in unreserved GPs, who mostly are men. Also in terms of prior political experience, there's a difference, as you can see here, 0.22 or 22% in the unreserved and 11% in the reserved. And also, but in terms of sort of having previously been a sarpanch, the overall numbers are quite low, which might be a little surprising. There's also a much higher percentage of women receiving assistance with daily operations and being accompanied to GP meetings. Okay, so on the balance, no difference, as I said, no difference on households or GPs. Randomization thus appears to be ineffective, although female leaders suffer from several handicaps. Okay, I'm not going to sort of frighten you with these equations. I'm just going to tell you briefly what we do. So we use first the cross-sectional data that we have and look at program process experiences of households from our survey. And one thing that's of course, we sort of have a key variable here being whether it's reserved or not. And then we have lots of controls for household characteristics, for GP and sarpanch characteristics. And importantly, we use dummies for we use mandal level dummies. And the idea behind that is to take out variation in the quality and implementation and capacity for implementation of the program at the mandal level, which is important. So that's it's neat, an important thing to do. And then we do the panel specification, which I'm going to show in a table, which is much more intuitive than this. So I'm just going to skip through this. Okay, so if we look at the cross section here, what we get is that these are coefficients on GPs reserved for female, right? So there are different process outcomes here. First is with the first variables refer to registration with the program. And the first line here, first row here, is whether a household has been asked to make payment for job card. So this is significant, and the difference between column 1 and 2 is just in the controls that we use, which you can see at the bottom. But essentially, the message here is that a household is much more likely to have been asked to pay a bribe in a reserved GP. And that goes against many of the arguments that we've seen earlier here. Also, in terms of receiving program benefits, there are some signs of more administrative inefficiencies in GPs reserved for females, right? So the row 4 here is weeks for wage payment receipt, which is significant but less strongly so, but also suggests works in the same direction. And then the last line, line 7, conditional on being asked to verify labor records, there's a higher chance that a household has found a discrepancy in reserved GPs compared to unreserved GPs. So all these 3 which I've marked in red, the last one is on the wrong of the 2 coefficients anyway. But for all these three outcomes or experiences, the direction here points towards a disadvantage from being in a GP reserved for women in terms of the quality of Vegard delivery. And that goes against, as I said, many of these other findings that we've seen. Okay, so what we do here is to try to deal with the fact that experience might be, technically speaking, endogenous. And we restrict our sample here to GPs which had a closely contested election. And the idea behind doing that is to try to do our best to make our experience variable as credible as possible. We don't have an IV option, and we try to sort of take away potential unobservables at the GP level that might be correlated with the outcomes that we are looking at. So this is an exercise that is useful in the sense that sorry, I needed the pointer here. Okay, so what we need to do here is these are resemble the coefficients we looked at above, and if you look at all these, you can see that outcomes here are worse in isolation in reserved GPs. But if you control, we put in an interaction for female experience here, or for experience, political experience, sorry, and the impact of being female then with experience is the sum of these 2 coefficients. So what we see here is that once you control for this experience, these adverse effects of female reservations are neutralized, or their signs actually change, right? So here, for instance, there's a net benefit to having a female sarpanch as long as this person has experience. Okay, so now I'm going to take you to the sort of the main story that we have. And which relates to what happens over time here in female reserved GPs. And we use the audit data, and I've sort of simplified the regression, so I've taken out a lot of stuff from this regression and the controls that we use. And the main thing here, is again that we look at GP reserved for female. There are different types of irregularities that we look at here. These are related to labor. This is the total number of labor irregularities registered in the audit data and filed by the social audit team. Farzana is going to talk more about the social audit process in a little while, so I'll leave that to her. And then we also have material-related irregularities. So the interesting thing here to note is that there's some differences between column 1, 2, and 3. If we do a robustness test on this specification, we actually get a positive coefficient here also. And then what happens over time is essentially, if we start here, there's a female disadvantage in year 1, female disadvantage in year 1. By the next year, the impact of female leadership is the sum of these coefficients, and that sort of adds up more or less to 0. Similarly here, similarly here, similarly here, similarly here, and so forth. So what we observe here over time, and this is the sort of, sorry, I'll get back to that one. So the way to interpret these specifications is the following. So inexperienced women political leaders perform worse than men during the first year in office. This is panel, right? What is interesting here is that they rapidly progress, and not just in a remedial sense. So it's fine, thanks you. It's not just in a remedial sense, right? So it's not just some catching up, it's complete catching up. So from the second year, these women political leaders perform as well as men, neither better nor worse. And that is once these, whatever disadvantages they face to start with, come to an end, right? Yeah, as I mentioned, the sort of, we do many robustness tests in our paper. This is one of them, and that is how we get the sort of the coefficient that I looked at in the first column as well, so that these results align rather nicely across these different type of irregularities. Okay, there could be some rival explanations here. There are problems, potential problems with the reporting biases in the data that we have. But I think the way we've approached this issue by looking at analysis based on the irregularities and complaints filed by the social audit team in the panel, that should take care of that. Also in terms of potential gender stereotypes, which is quite a lot influenced in the literature. We also find, of course, that these results vary by the Sarpanch experience. We talk about this much more in the paper. Okay, so to conclude here, if we look at the cross-section, we find more corruption and poor administration in GPs with female reserve Sarpanches. This is before we look at the role of experience, right? So that goes against the sort of the ethos of this early literature, which is very optimistic about the prospects and what happens to governance and to corruption when women political leaders enter office. So that's an important nuancing. Once we take account of prior political experience, we do observe a different outcome and sometimes a reversal of that negative impact, as I showed you in that table. And that relates particularly to corruption-related governance issues in these reserved GPs. Okay, on the social audit panel data, just to repeat, so is this remedial catching up or a net governance gain? So if you have a situation, if you look at the behavioral experimental literature on women, which points towards many of these apparent attitudinal and other advantages that women might offer, for instance, if women are more development-oriented than men, in contexts like South Asia, that may take some time to kick in if women's entry is into arenas where they have little experience, as the case might be in politics, right? So as experience then builds up, governance in councils with female reservations should improve. This is what we observe. But while these women quickly catch up, we don't observe any net governance gains, which is consistent with one particular sort of take on this literature, which is due to Bardhan, Dilip Mukherjee, and a co-author of theirs, which essentially is that political reservations, for whatever other advantages they may offer, and whatever justice and other arguments you may have for advocating them, is that there might be costs to start with, and that these costs are anchored in the fact that you get people into office who simply have less political baggage and less experience and other sort of attributes to offer. If you sort of want to extend this or sort of take a thought on what this might mean in the Pakistani context, remember that Andhra Pradesh is a state in India which in terms of gender equality is pretty well off compared to the northern Indian states and to other states in other parts of India and well in the south as well. So what we have here may be sort of some lower bound estimates of the impacts of these initial costs of women entering politics at this level. I think that's all. Thank you.